Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. This is In Conservation With. I'm David Lindo, and today I've been looking forward to this particular episode for some time because I got my now very good friend, Per Alstöm. I mean, Per and I don't actually go back that far, do we, Per?
No.
We actually go back, we actually met for the first time at the Spurn Migration Festival last September, where Per gave an amazing talk on taxonomy. And that's, I mean, plus I've known about Per, as many of you have, for some time now. So thank you very much for coming along, Per. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm not too bad, actually, under the circumstances. I've got a bit of COVID-19, but it's all right. I'm very lucky. So very mild symptoms.
You had the distinction of being the very first of my guests to actually be on with COVID-19. May I ask you how bad or how not bad was it? Or is it?
Well, I've been extremely lucky, really. So I've had very, very mild symptoms. So it's not stopped me from working or birding local. I mean, I've been working at home, so I haven't been with others, and I've been birding on my own, so I haven't been with others either. But anyway, I've been lucky to live in a place where I can just walk outside and have some nice birds around.
Okay, and are you unwell now still, or are you?
Well, I think it started like 2 weeks ago, and I can still feel it. So yeah, but I'm basically all right. And it's been, I've been so lucky. It's been very, very mild. So.
Okay. Now let me just quickly run through what we have here, because basically your biog is an extensive one. For those who don't really know of Per's background, he is a professor of ornithology working at Uppsala University, and that's in Sweden, in the Department of Ecology and Genetics. And previously you've been at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, the Swedish Species Information Center, and the Swedish Museum of Natural History. You are a very keen birder, and I know that because I've had the pleasure of birding with you very briefly in Yorkshire. And you started traveling abroad at a very early age. Can I ask you, actually, one of the questions that, because for me, I saw your name, I've seen your name for years in lots of scientific journals. And, as a young birder myself, you have these people that you see, and they're kind of up in the clouds somewhere, all these eminent people. And for me, you were one of them. How did it start? How did you actually become interested in nature? What was your process?
Well, it's very, actually, I've been interested all of my life, more or less. I really can't answer that question properly, but I do remember that I was more interested in bears when I was younger than in birds. Growing up in Gothenburg on the west coast of Sweden, I didn't see many bears, but I saw a lot of birds. So I gradually switched my interest from bears to birds. And ever since then, I've been a birder by heart. So
when you say bears, I mean, how did that actually start? I mean, what was that about?
I really don't know. It must have been, I probably saw them on TV or had books about bears. I'm not sure really, but I found them extremely fascinating. I still do. I mean, I love bears. I'm still very keen on bears and mammals in general. And pretty much anything in nature I enjoy watching, but birds are so easy to watch, and they're everywhere, and there's lots of them, and they're beautiful and interesting and fascinating in every respect, and it's just fabulous.
And my American colleagues often ask the question, and I always say this to a lot of my guests, I always ask this, what was the spark? Was there a spark moment? I know you transcended from bears to birds. But was there a spark moment? Was there a particular
No,
species you remember seeing?
no, there wasn't, because I was too young, so I can't even remember when I started. And strangely enough, none of my parents were interested in birds or nature for that part. So I really don't know. It just, I just grew up a birder.
And what about your family now? Are they anyone interested in birds? Any of your kids?
Not really. No, I've failed miserably on that.
Okay,
Yeah,
listen. Let me just carry on with your bio. So basically, you've been traveling abroad from an early age.
yeah,
Altogether, you've spent several years in the field in some 20 countries
yeah,
in Asia, as well as multiple trips to other parts of the world, including North America and parts of Africa.
yeah.
What is your favorite area of the world to be watching birds?
That's a really hard question, because there are so many nice places in the world. I've probably spent more time I've surely spent more time in China than in any other foreign country. So, I mean, I love China. Uh, India is very special as well. India and Nepal, very special countries, because not only because of the birds, but also because of there's a lot of mammals there, and yeah, I mean, culture is fascinating, food is amazing, and in recent years I've really fallen in love with Africa, and yeah, so yeah, there's so many places I love, really. Yeah, it's hard to say which is my favorite place, really. So
Okay,
many favorite places.
yeah, I'm sure. And you are the author of 100 scientific and 60 popular science articles, including many on difficult to identify bird species, which is great because I'm like a lot of birders, I'm really quite fascinated with difficult families like warblers and pipits and larks and things like that, and gulls. And the first author of two highly acclaimed books, The Field Guide to Rare Birds of Britain and Europe in 1991, and Pipits and Wagtails of Europe, Asia, North America. And you're co-author for chapters in 2 volumes of the Handbook of the Birds of the World and several chapters of the largest avian radiation, the evolution of perching birds, or the order Passeriformes. So that's impressive. And at the moment, you're also working with another person I know, Paul Donald from the RSPB. You're
Yep.
currently writing a handbook to the larks of the world, which is really fascinating because the larks is such a complex group. I mean, I remember when I went to South Africa and, I was looking at a lark thinking, what is that? And in fact, I videoed a couple of larks and I still don't know what they are to this day.
All right. Yeah.
But then there's been a lot of splits, haven't there?
Yeah, there has been, and there will be many more to come. So yeah, if you'd had a book, you would have been safe in South Africa.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
So let's start basically. So I need to. I mean, taxonomy. The whole idea of different species is so fascinating to all of us here, I'm sure. I'm wondering. I mean, I mentioned to you earlier. I think to myself a lot. Why do some species that look the same are split, and other species that, to me, have really distinct populations, to my non-scientific eyes, are not split? So, for example, you got the white wagtail and the pied wagtail, which they are kind of. I mean, they radiate. I mean, the further east you go, the more distinct they become, I suppose. But you kind of think, well, why aren't they split? Yet the hooded crow is split from the carrion crow. What is, for the layman, how are species defined?
Yeah, well, I mean, you've got, as you say, you've got a lot of variation, and if you look at the wagtails, which you mentioned first, the white wagtails and the yellow wagtails, they've radiated enormously in plumage. So there's lots of different looking birds, but genetically they're very similar. So if you take a white wagtail from the UK and compare it to one from Japan, genetically they're almost identical, but they'll look very different. And the same if you take a yellow wagtail from northern Sweden and compare it to a very different looking bird from, say, Central Asia. You take one of the yellow, the Lutea subspecies, which has got a yellow supercilium and green crown, and you compare that to our Swedish Flava subspecies or Thunbergi subspecies, which have got grey heads. Flava's got a white supercilium. They're genetically almost identical, but there are, of course, certain differences between them, but these differences are only in a small number of genes. So most of the genome is just identical. So what we're looking at is just a fraction of the genome that codes for the distinctive appearances, but they've got a very recent history. So they've only split quite recently from each other. Then you've got other examples, like you've got some larks that look almost identical, and they've been separated for millions of years and they haven't changed at all. Then you've got other cases where you've got things that look the same, but they aren't closely related. So you've got things that have evolved similarities in appearance because they live under similar circumstances. They feed on the same things, they live in the same habitat, and therefore they've evolved very similar appearances. So that's called convergent evolution or parallel evolution. So there's so much variation in nature that you can't. It's hard to describe for that reason, because there's so many things happening on so many different levels, and sometimes things become similar, sometimes things just diverge enormously. So you've also got some examples of birds that don't look at all close to their similar to the closest relatives. One of the things that I could mention is a pipit that occurs on the island of Buru in Indonesia, which was previously thought to be a white eye. I mean, white eyes are completely different from pipits. They live up in the canopy of the trees. They're little green and yellow, green and white things. And this bird, this madanga, as it's called, it creeps around on branches and tree trunks, sometimes head down like a nuthatch. It's green on the upper parts, grey on the underparts. It's got a rufous throat. Doesn't look anything like a pipit. Doesn't behave anything like a pipit. But it's closely related to a tree pipit. That's completely bizarre. And as we mentioned the wagtails before, there is a wagtail on the island of the island of Sao Tome of West Africa, which was previously considered to be a kind of warbler. And it's a little brown thing with a short tail that jumps around in the forest, on the ground and up on branches and tree trunks. And it's a wagtail. It's right in the wagtail group, together with all the other wagtails. I could actually show on my screen, if you want to see, I can show some pictures of these.
That'd be amazing.
See, share screen, and I should have something here somewhere. Urban bird here. So let me see if I can find those wagtails that I mentioned. Yeah, here. If we look at, can you see the screen here?
Yeah, we can see the screen.
Okay then. So here's a tree of the wagtails and pipits, and you can see here on this little branch here, you've got this madanga. It's photographed here by Rob Hutchinson climbing on a tree trunk, and I've actually got a bigger picture here. So I mean, look at this madanga. It's not at all in any respect similar to any of the pipits, which are all ground feeding things. Although tree pipits do land in trees and sit in trees when they're singing and so on, but they all feed on the ground, they nest on the ground, and they just look totally different. And also here's the Sao Tome wagtail, as it's now called. It was previously placed in the genus Amorocycla. It should be in the genus Motacilla, like the yellow wagtail and white wagtail. I'll change that straight away so you see, now it's become a wagtail. And you see it's right here, it's right in the middle of the wagtail group. So it's genetically it's a classic wagtail, but it's diverged so much in plumage and habitat and behavior from all the wagtails. So same with this madanga here. And I would say the reason why these have diverged so much in their appearance is because they have adapted to completely new habitats, completely new feeding niches compared to their close relatives. So that's what's driven the evolution of divergence in this case. I could show you some other bizarre examples. Look here, for example. Well, no, sorry, that seems Swedish, but if you look at these, three of these are closely related, and it's just impossible, without knowing, it's impossible to say which one is not closely related to the others. But it's actually this one, the ground jay, the Henderson's ground jay, that is different from all the others. So this, the ground tit, it was previously called Hume's ground pecker, and it's a tit. It's actually more closely related to the great tit than the great tit to the blue tit. What? I mean, it's bizarre, isn't it?
That's incredible.
It is absolutely remarkable, but in this case, I think it's sort of understandable because the ground tit occurs on the Tibetan plateau, where the habitat is totally different from the habitat where all the other tits occur, which is sort of forested or scrubby bushy areas. But I mean, there's hardly any scrub, certainly no trees up on the Tibetan plateau where this one occurs. So it nests in holes in the ground, not in holes in the trees because there aren't any trees. And the ground is pretty hard. So it's evolved a very strong bill that it can sort of dig into the ground. So it was called a ground pecker before. So it's digging into the ground for food. And its plumage has changed also as an adaptation to the habitat where it occurs. So that's a pretty remarkable thing. Here's another funny thing. If you look,
one more thing, right. Going back to the previous slides, the ground jay, does it behave in the same way? Is it convergent evolution in terms of the way they behave, or do they behave differently to
the ground jay?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they're both hopping around on the ground, digging into the ground for food. So in that sense, you could say there is convergent evolution, and also their plumages are relatively similar. So in that sense, it's a case of convergent evolution. And when you compare it to these ones, it's very strongly divergent evolution. Yeah, it's an absolutely fascinating example of evolution.
Okay.
And here's another one. If you look at the let's see, I'll move that. If you look at the these birds here, the bearded reedling is pretty similar to the reed parrotbill in general appearance and in habitat. It breeds and it's found in reed beds essentially. I mean, there are of course differences between them, but basically they look pretty similar. But in fact, the bearded reedling is the closest relative of the larks. Yes, I'm not kidding. It's true. And the only way we found that out was by using genetics. So without DNA, we would never have guessed that. And you probably think that, wow, the bearded reedling is a very weird bird. But in fact, it's the larks that are weird. Because if you look at the entire big group in which these birds occur, bearded reedlings and reed parrotbills and crested larks, the larks are the oddballs because they are found in open habitats, whereas all the others in this group, which I can actually show you in another picture here, they occur in sort of forests or scrub or marshlands. So this is the superfamily Sylvioidea, and it includes everything that we call warblers. So all the ones here with red frames around them, like the Chetty's warblers. What is that? That's a scrub warblers, leaf warblers. Here is sylvid warblers like blackcaps and whitethroats. Here is acrocephalus warblers. Here is Madagascar warblers. Here's cisticolid warblers. Here's grasshopper warblers. And then you've got the bearded reedling and the larks, and you've got swallows. You've got babblers of various kinds, white eyes. You've got long-tailed tits. So this is just a mix of things that are closely related, but the warblers do not form a group together. So they have just been considered to be closely related previously because they share similarities in appearance, because they eat the same things. So they're all little insectivorous birds, and therefore the old taxonomists, they thought they were all closely related. But when we started analyzing their relationships using DNA, we realized, no, they're not at all closely related. Well, I mean, they are closely related still, but they're not each other's closest relatives, all of these, because there's so much else mixed in here. So that's pretty fascinating, I think. And well, here's another example. We did a study where we looked at, well, lots of different birds, most ossine passerines actually, and this thing here is a wren babbler. This thing here was also considered to be a wren babbler, but they look similar, but they're not closely related. Here is all the traditional wren babblers are in here. All the classic wren babblers are in this big group here. And this little thing here, which is now called the spotted elacura, is here on its own branch. So it doesn't have any close living relatives at all, which is really, really odd. So it's, I would say it's maybe the most lonely bird in the world.
Wow.
And it's got, so here's the distribution. It occurs in the eastern Himalayas and neighboring mountain areas, and also in southeast China. I'll see if I can play the song here. It's got a really weird song. See if this works. I don't know where you can hear it. Can you hear it?
Yeah, I can hear it. I'm hoping everyone else can.
It's a really, really weird song. I can't think of any other bird that sounds similar to this. So that's a real weirdo.
So this bird is totally like on its own in its own sort of evolution, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So actually, I mean, for sure, this bird has had relatives, but they've gone extinct. So there's surely been more branches on this long branch here, but they no longer exist. So now it's the only surviving relative of this lineage, of this branch here. So if we'd been living maybe a few million years ago, there would have been other close relatives of this one, but they're no longer around. Cool, isn't it?
It's
yeah. I can show you another example here. So if we zoom in on this warbler tree and look at one of the groups of warblers, the Setidae, this is a group that, well, all the ones in black color here, I didn't expect you to read any of the names here, but all the ones in black color, they were placed in the same genus, the genus Setia, before, and they all look pretty much like this. So they're like a British Chettis warbler. So brown, paler below, rather long tail. But when we did the molecular analysis, we realized that these brown ones are actually scattered across this tree, and you got some really different looking ones mixed in with them. So you've got these little TCS. You've got, see, I need to move that a little bit, otherwise you can't see that beautiful little bird there. So, for example, this chestnut-headed TCS is most closely related to the grey-sided bush warbler, which looks like this. Totally different looking things. And previously, nobody, before we did the genetic analysis, nobody had the idea that these were closely related. So this has been revolutionary, I would say. Using the genetic tools that we have today has been absolutely revolutionary for understanding evolutionary relationships among birds and the evolution of birds. And well, we'll see if I can play the songs of these. So yeah, so here's the chestnut-headed TCS. I hope you could hear that. So here's the grey-sided bush warbler, its closest relative.
The similarity, isn't it?
Yeah, so interestingly, their songs are much more similar than their appearances. So the songs haven't diverged so much as their appearances have. So plumage-wise, structurally, they look incredibly different. And here's another interesting little fellow. This is the, it was previously placed in the genus Hemitesia, in its own genus Hemitesia. And it occurs in the mountains of East Africa in a very small area. And it's the only representative of this big group that occurs in Africa, except for the Chettis warbler, which occurs in North Africa only. But you wonder, how on earth did it get there? So, I mean, birds can fly. So its ancestors surely flew there. But what's probably happened is that there was a big distribution from somewhere in Asia all the way down to East Africa. And all of that has now disappeared. So there is only this little tiny relic population left in East Africa, in the mountains there. And then all the area in between has been sort of cleared of Chettis warblers. There are none in between. Cool, isn't it?
It's incredible.
Yeah, it is. It is. And you wonder, how on earth does this happen? I mean, having so much variation within this clade, so much variation in plumage and vocalizations and convergence and divergence, and it's just stunning.
It's also very confusing as well, because I'm a layman birder, and I'm sure that there's people here in the Zoom room, the Zoomers here, that may have questions themselves, but I'm a very basic layman, and I feel very frustrated because in the beginning, when I first started birding, you pick up a field guide, it starts with divers, grebes, and ends with crows. Mm-hmm. And then over a period of time, the divers and grebes will move forward, and it starts with ducks now and ends with buntings. And now, you know, I mean, obviously there's been lots of changes since then, but now they're saying to me, oh, by the way, falcons are related to parrots and not birds of prey. Oh, skuas are much more, or Jaegers for those who are in America, are much more closely related to auks than they are to gulls. And it's just thrown everything up in the air. And for me, it's frustrating because, especially if you are a beginner birder, you pick up a book and the order is changed every time you pick up a new book.
Yeah, I know, and actually, I don't think it's necessary to change the order in the bird books. I mean, what's the point of having a field guide? It's for identification purposes. So you want it to be simple and easily understood, and therefore the best thing would be to group things that look similar together, and then keep and then keep and they just don't care about the evolutionary history of these birds. It's really not very important in a field guide. So it's perfectly all right to keep the falcons with the normal, the classic birds of prey. To my mind, you don't need to move them closer to the parrots and passerines. There's little point in that, other than, of course, I mean, it would be nice to have in the introduction a chapter describing the relationships of these birds. And in that chapter, you could, of course, point out that falcons are actually more closely related to parrots and passerines than to goshawks and eagles and buzzards. But in the field guide, it makes perfect sense to keep them close, keep the falcons close to the exhibitors, to the hawks. I think, at least.
I agree. There's a question here from Hans Thomas Krumenacker. He says that Frank Rind recently found 5 new species and 5 subspecies on an Indonesian island. Do you think we will see more similar spectacular discoveries of new species like that, or will we have new species mainly from splits and growing knowledge about genetics of birds we already know, although maybe under different names, families?
Yeah, well, actually, I don't think, I mean, most of the birds in the world have been discovered already. It was very lucky for Frank Rind and his colleagues to find so many new birds in a very small area, and they did it very cleverly, because they looked specifically for an island or islands where they considered it very likely for birds to have evolved distinct characters, because these islands had been isolated for a long period. Most of the islands in Indonesia have been, or at least many of them, have been connected during glacial periods. So they've been connected when sea water levels have risen, and then they've been, as the water levels have dropped down again, they've become isolated as islands. But these islands where those new birds were found had very deep water levels between them. So they've never been connected during the glacial periods. And therefore they predicted that these islands could have anciently diverged lineages. But I think there are relatively few places where you can actually find a lot of new species of birds in the world. That I would imagine some very remote areas of New Guinea or South America, of especially in the Amazon, for example, where people just haven't been, especially if there's some really special habitats or some other, well, isolating factors in those areas. That's possible, but I mean, not a lot of new birds will be found. There's in the last 20 years or so, there've been on average 5 new species found every year, but we'll still experience an increase in the number of bird species, because there will be lots of splits. And I just got some really fascinating data a few days ago. We got DNA sequence data from a lot of larks that had never been sequenced before. So we got DNA from old museum specimens of taxa that have not been sequenced before. And we realized that, for example, the rufous-naped lark in Africa is, well, a bunch of species rather than just a single species as it's treated as today. And so that's based on the DNA in combination, I would say, with morphological characteristics. Very little is known about their vocalizations and behaviors and so on. So it would be fascinating to travel around and look at all those in the field, which would take quite a long time and cost a bit of money, but it would be incredibly interesting to do that.
You yourself have been behind or co-found, well, certainly one species named after you, but you've co-found, what, 6 or 7 different species. Can you tell us about that?
Most of those birds most of those discoveries that I've been involved with have been discovered thanks to their distinctive vocalizations. So, for example, there's a bird called M.A. leaf warbler, Philoscopus emaensis, which was, when we first found it, it was on the mountain M.A. Shan in Sichuan province in China, and we heard a bird with a very odd song, and we found it, and we thought, what? That's just Philoscopus reguloides, it was called at the time. Now it's Philoscopus claudia. But anyway, we thought it was just a common leaf warbler in the area because it looked just identical to it. And it took us several years before we actually found several individuals on this mountain, in a different part of the mountain that we'd not been to before. And we could confirm that they actually looked slightly different. There were minor differences in appearance, and the vocal differences were consistent. So it was not just a bird with a very odd song or a certain unusual song type. We did playback tests where we played the song of this new bird to the local ones and vice versa. And they didn't respond to each other's songs, but they responded immediately, very strongly to their own song. And I mean, after we described the bird many years later, we actually did genetics as well. And it's a very, very distinctive species that is not at all closely related to the one that it looks similar to. And it's been like that with most of the new species that I've been involved with. We've heard things that sound different from anything else. I've actually got an example here on my screen. Can you see this thing here? Can you see the screen there?
Yeah.
So this bird was previously believed to be a russet bush warbler, Lucustella mandeli, or Bradypteris mandeli, it was previously called. And it sounds like this. See if you can hear it. It's got a very weird song. It's very unbird-like, and you can see the sonograms here. It's got a very, very high-pitched song. And then we heard birds that sounded like this. So you could hear that, and you can look at the sonograms here. You can see that it is much, much lower pitched. You see it's the same scale here. So you see this one's much lower pitched than this one here. So we realized that these must be different, and we traveled around China. So we first found them here in the Sichuan province of China. And we traveled around a bit, and we found these birds with a low-pitched song in these areas up here. And we found birds with high-pitched song down here into Thailand and Myanmar, Northeast India as well, actually. And in some places, we found them together. So this map shows, zooming in on part of Sichuan province, where we found them together, actually. And in the area where they occurred together, they were mainly altitudinally segregated. So the low-pitched song occurred at lower elevation, high-pitched song at higher elevation. And on one occasion, we actually found one of each right next to each other on either side of a trail. And when we played the high-pitched song, we caught the high-pitched bird in the mist net, but the low-pitched bird didn't respond at all. Then we switched to the low-pitched song, and we caught that one in the same mist net. So in this case, they obviously had overlapping territories, but didn't interact, didn't bother, didn't care about the other's presence. And yeah, so it's just a molecular tree which shows them to occur in different groups here. So they were clearly different species, and we named this new one Locustella chengi. So we named it after China's most famous ornithologist, Cheng Chorsin, who sadly is no longer with us, but I had the privilege of meeting him a few times in the 1980s. And he was a remarkable person who has been absolutely super important for Chinese ornithology. And so we thought it was appropriate to name this bird in honor of him. Yeah, so that's one example of a bird that's been discovered thanks to its distinctive song. And then, of course, you need to confirm these differences in vocalizations with differences in plumage structure, genetics, etc.
Yeah, and you have a warbler named after yourself, Alstöm's warbler. How did that come about?
Well, it was a bird that I haven't got any slides here of it actually, but it's a bird that we discovered in central China, and yeah, it was previously considered a single species, the golden spectacled warbler, Caecurchus burkii was called, and it's got a wide range throughout the Himalayas, central China, southeast China, northern Vietnam, Myanmar. So it's got a big range, this single species as it was previously thought. And we realized that this is not a single species, it's actually more than one species. And it turned out to be 6 different species, which were very anciently diverged. So they have been separated from each other by millions of years, but they look extremely similar. But this little bird that we named as a new species, we called it Caecurchus soror, soror meaning sister, and we didn't give it an English name actually. We just proposed the scientific name. When the Handbook of the Birds of the World was published, I wrote the text for this species and the other Caecurchus warblers, and they didn't have an English name, but of course they had to have an English name in the book. So the editors suggested it should be called Alstöm's warbler. It was actually it was Frank Rhind who suggested that in a paper in the Bulletin of the Oriental Bird Club some years before. But anyway, the editors of the handbook thought that it should be called Alstöm's warbler, and I thought it was a little bit embarrassing because I wrote that text. So I said, well, everybody will think that I chose that name, which I didn't. So they actually wrote in the introduction that this name was our choice. It was not Per Alstöm's choice. So yeah, so I hope that people will read that.
Well, I hope I write a book one day and I get a species named after me like that. It'd be great.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions? Any of you Zoomers have any questions? I mean, it's been so much information here to think about. So anyone would like to ask a question?
Well, in the meantime, I could.
Sorry.
Oh, have you got a question? Otherwise, I can mention another thing that I'm working on at the moment.
Yeah, we'll carry on then.
Yeah. So I'm just hopefully tomorrow.
Sorry, there's a question here from Hans Thomas Krumanaka. He says, which species model you follow?
Sorry, which what? Sorry.
What species model do you follow?
Which species concept I follow? I don't really follow any species concept. I mean, there are so many different species concept, and in ornithology, there are two main ones. So one is the biological species concept, which was formulated by Ernst Mayr, which treats different species as populations that are interbreeding among each other, but reproductively isolated from other such groups. And so there, it's the interbreeding and reproductive isolation that are the two main things. And then you've got the phylogenetic species concept, as it's called, which was formulated, well, the ornithological variant was formulated by Joel Craycraft. And it treats species as groups that are identifiable by some diagnostic features. So in that case, you could treat most of the wagtails as different species under the phylogenetic species concept. You could treat them as different species because they are all diagnosably different. You can distinguish a Thunbergi northern yellow wagtail from a Flava yellow wagtail, the southern one, or your British yellow wagtail. They're diagnosably different. Therefore, under that concept, they are different species, despite that they have diverged very, very recently and are genetically almost identical, as I mentioned before. If you look at if you use instead the biological species concept, Ernst Mayr's concept, they are more appropriately treated as the same species, because they do interbreed when they have a chance to do that. So they come into contact in some areas, not your British one. Well, yes, it does actually in Holland, Belgium, and France. But so the ones that have abutting ranges, marginally sympatric ranges, marginal overlapping ranges, they will interbreed and they will form hybrid zones, and therefore Ernst Mayr favored treating them as the same species. But sorry. So to me, it's not really important whether they're treated as the same or different species. Now there's a lot of echo. I don't know whether you can hear that as well, but I can hear my voice echoing. Now I think it's okay now. So to me, it's not really important. It doesn't really matter whether they're treated as different species or as different subspecies, because they are equally interesting irrespective of their taxonomic rank. And they look different. They, in some cases, sound different. They behave pretty similarly, but they're just interesting. And I mean, speciation is a gradual process, and therefore you have to accept that you can't put everything into nice boxes, into nice pigeonholes. You have to accept that you can't divide everything the way you wish to. I mean, it's like, look at me. Am I old? No, of course not. But compared to my daughter or my son, I'm old. Am I adult? Yes, probably. Am I tall? No, not really. Not compared to a basketball player, but compared to some African pygmies, I'm tall. So it's all very subjective, and it's a gradual thing, and separating a continuum into different neat boxes is just, it has to be subjective and partly arbitrary. So you just have to accept that when it comes to different species, that some birds, some organisms, species, subspecies, doesn't matter.
Okay.
The nice way.
A question here from Alan. Alan?
Hello there, Per.
Hello.
Hi, Per. I just wondered if is there any sort of common bird at the moment, some population that we consider as sort of quite common that is going through or you feel will go through the process of changing and speciation occurring. I know it's a process of millions of years and that sort of thing, but is there something sort of obvious that stands out at this point in time?
Good question. Well, I'm sure there's lots of cases. I mean, in effect, every single bird is undergoing change. So, but we will not be able to see that. But maybe something that's become isolated on an island in recent time, or something that's become isolated because of climate change or because of human interference, is more likely to change over time than something that's got a huge population and wide distribution. Field fares came to Iceland and Greenland not that long ago, if I remember correctly. So therefore, if they don't have any contact with other field fares for a long time, they will change for sure. I'm sure there's lots of cases, and islands is the most likely place to look, really, because things can happen more quickly on islands because they're small populations and they're isolated, and they can be isolated for long periods. But I can't really think of any.
Okay, all right.
Suitable.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Jitan Jali would love to hear about the discovery of Himalayan forest thrush.
All right.
You know about
that? Yes. So let me see. How did it start? Yeah. So it's hard to say when it started, but one very obvious moment was when I was together with Shashank Dalvi from India, up in Arunachal Pradesh in northeastern India. And we heard two different types of thrush song up there, from which were coming from birds that looked like a plain-backed thrush. Plain-backed thrush is a rather widely distributed species occurring in Himalayas and central China in the mountainous areas. And we heard birds in the alpine zone that had a very scratchy song, very unmusical, very sort of unpleasant song. And then we heard birds down in the forest that had a very nice, beautiful song. And I remember standing above the tree limit at sort of 4,100 meters and hearing both at the same time, one in the alpine zone close to where I was standing and one down in the forest below me. And the songs were so totally different that we realized that these can't be conspecific, even though they looked very similar. We did some simple playback tests and they seemed to ignore each other's songs. And then it was a very long process before we actually realized that the forest bird didn't have a name. So Pam Rasmussen was heavily involved there, doing morphological analysis, and Urban Olsen did the genetic work, sequencing lots of museum specimens. Then we realized that now this population occurring in the forest, it's unnamed, so we named it Himalayan. Well, we named it Suothra Salim Ali, and Salim Ali is after India's most famous ornithologist, Salim Ali, who sadly I never met, but he's been enormously important to Asian ornithology, and we thought it was most appropriate to name this bird in honor of him. So we found it original in the northeastern parts of India, in a few different places, and later we also found it in neighboring parts of China, in the Yunnan province of China. And we also realized that the populations occurring in the forest in central China is a different species. It's a third species, Zoanthera griseaceps. That already had a name, so we didn't have to name it. We just used an available name for that. So out of a single species, we got 3 different species, and one of them didn't have any previous name. So that was, in short, the story of the Himalayan forest thrush. And I remember, I mean, it got quite a lot of attention in the media. And I remember, I think it was Fox News or something that likened it to the Song of Adele. I think there was headlines saying new bird discovered that sings like Adele or something. It was rather silly, but it got quite a lot of attention anyway.
Good. Can Wei has asked, what about acoustic differences amongst sibling species? Is acoustic feature a character of unique evolutionary history, or indicates barriers to interbreeding?
Yeah, I would say in many cases, I mean, we generally believe that songs can act as reproductive isolating barriers. That is, a female of a certain bird will choose a male that sings similar to its father, whereas it will not be attracted to a bird that sings a very different song. And therefore, because of this mate preference and imprinting on its song, on its fathers and other, well, other birds of the same kind, sort of. Therefore, songs are believed to be important for reproductive isolation among species, and that's why songs are generally considered to be of great importance for taxonomy. And there was a second part of the question which I forgot. It was something about sibling species.
Basically, is acoustic feature a character of unique evolutionary history, or indicate barriers to interbreeding?
Yeah. So that was the interbreeding part, and then they could be many sibling species have got different songs. So I mentioned before that we discovered some new species thanks to their distinctive songs, but songs are partly innate and partly learned. So in the ossine passerines, which is the largest group of passerines, which is all the ones that we've got in Europe, for example, and most of the ones in North America, the songs are they're partly learned. They do have a preference for a certain type of song. So a chaffinch, a young male chaffinch will preferentially learn a chaffinch song over a great tit song. If it doesn't have any chaffinch tutor, it can learn something else. And if it doesn't have any tutor at all, it will develop a very strange song. Therefore, I mean, some people might think that songs are useless for taxonomic purposes because, in theory, they're mainly learned, and therefore they should be able to change very quickly. And songs apparently can change very quickly, but at a very small local scale. So it seems to take a long time for a song to spread over a large area, to become fixed over a large area. But that is the case if you look at, say, yellow-browed warbler, which has got a huge distribution all across northern Siberia. They sound pretty much the same throughout that range, which they've apparently occupied in a fairly recent time, most of it, because it was all, well, much of it was covered by ice only 10,000 years ago. Yeah, I don't know whether that was the answer to your question, but anyway.
It's interesting about songs, actually, Per, because we had in Conservation With a few weeks ago, Chris Watson, who is the sound man for David Attenborough, and he played us the song of the wren, the European wren, and which is familiar, obviously, to many people in Europe, and it was a classic song. But then he played it back super slow, and it was interesting because he was talking about the messages within the song, and playing it back super slow, the individual notes sounded like tropical birds, which made me suddenly think, hang on a minute, wrens as a family come from the Americas, and the majority of the species of, I think there's 280 species or whatever, majority of them come from the tropics in South America. And the wren that we have in Europe and further east is the only representative of that family outside of Americas. So maybe its song actually tells us about its origins. Is that a wrong assumption to make, do you think? Is there that kind of relationship?
Well, it's an interesting hypothesis that can be tested. I don't have an opinion on it at the moment, but it's certainly an interesting thing to pursue. Yeah, bird songs. It's interesting, as you say. If you play a song at a slow rate, it sounds totally different from what it normally sounds like. And birds have got a much finer tuned hearing than we have, so they can surely detect much finer differences than we can detect. So if you take, for example, a yellow wagtail song, it sounds very, very simple. But if you look at a sonogram and sort of expand it, or play the song back really slowly, you can hear there's a lot of fine-tuned variation within the song. There's a lot of things happening within the song, even though it's just a very, very short, simple note to our ear. So there could be a lot of information that we are missing just because our hearing is not fine enough.
Yeah, Andy Hultberg. How important are calls and other sounds? So I'm presuming he's meaning how important are they to sort of differentiate between, a species and, being a species and not being a species?
Yeah, well, in general, for taxonomy, songs are generally considered more important because they are used for mate attraction and therefore important for reproductive isolation among species. But in general, many people think that calls can be actually more important for taxonomy because they are believed to be to a high degree innate than songs, so inherited. But we've just discovered something incredibly interesting with the Hume's warbler, which my first observations were back in the early 1980s in northwestern India, and I've got quite a few sound recordings from that period, and it seems that its calls have changed totally in those 30, 40, whatever years. So none of the call notes that I sound recorded in the 1980s are today present within the population of Hume's warbler. So it's changed its call totally in just a few decades, which is, to me, quite amazing and a really fascinating example of enormously fast evolutionary change in these birds. So we haven't published this yet. We're still working on it, but it's a really fascinating example, I think.
It's incredible. It just shows how little we know about the whole order of things. Zoomers, anyone else would like to ask a question?
I don't know whether I should, if nobody's got a question, I could, I started saying before that I was, oh, can you see my screen again, by the way?
No, you have to reshare, but basically...
Oh, sorry, I just, yeah.
Sorry, Sasha's just got a question. I found that resident blackcaps in southern Italy sound very different in song from migrant birds in northern Europe. Could this mean that they could eventually become a new species, or is this an example of learnt song within a species?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in theory, they could become a new species. I would say in order to become a new species, they will have to be geographically isolated from the others, because if they're in contact, it's very unlikely that this distinct song type will remain distinct. It will probably change with time because of vocal introgression from other populations. But if those birds with a distinctive song type will become geographically isolated for a long period, yes, they could certainly become a different species. And somebody else mentioned to me recently, a friend went to somewhere in South Europe and was stunned by the song of the blackcap, that it was so completely different from Swedish birds. So, I mean, there surely is a lot of variation within the blackcap in songs, and yeah, there's lots of examples. We've got the redwing in Sweden, which is another interesting example of a bird that's got very distinctive vocal dialects, and nobody's done a study of that. So it would be fascinating to actually do that and sound record birds from throughout its range. And it would be even more fascinating if you could compare that to old sound recordings to see whether those populations, those dialects have been consistent over time, or whether they've changed in a few decades, like those Hume's warblers I mentioned before. But yeah, something that needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, there's another question here from Hans Thomas Kumanaka. What could be the possible explanations for bird changing its song so radically as you described with the Hume's warbler?
I think in the case of the Hume's warbler, it's probably just chance. So that would be my main explanation. In the case of some changes in songs, for example, I mean, songs are believed to be under sexual selection. So a female would choose a male with a nice song, would prefer a male with a nicer song than a male with a duller song, and therefore there could be a strong selective force for a change in songs. And I mean, over time they could change for that reason. With calls, it's slightly less clear, because the selective forces are likely to be different. It's they're probably not under sexual selection, because males and females both call and they've got the same type of calls. It could be other factors, could be in some cases perhaps related to the habitat. Some calls might travel better through a certain environment than other calls, for example. But anyway, I think chance is possibly or probably involved in the change of calls and songs as well.
Okay. Well, look, we're kind of coming to the end of our kind of official part of the episode. What I want to do after saying goodbye officially is to continue this conversation as a gallery conversation, because there's a couple more questions here, and I want to give people the opportunity, if they want to go. So officially, I'd like to thank you very much, Per, for coming today. And by the way, quickly, what's your favorite bird?
When I was a teenager, my favorite bird was the tree pipit. I loved tree pipits. I could spend hours and hours watching a single tree pipit, and I would crawl after them in the forest. I just love them. I also loved chiffchaffs, especially the Swedish subspecies Abiatinus, which I think is such a beautiful little creature. I still like tree pipits. There may be other birds that I like even more. I'm not sure really. I mean, all birds are amazing. They're fantastic. They're beautiful. Yeah. I can't say.
Would I assume that your favorite mammal's a bear? Is it?
No, it's a tiger. Tiger is my favorite mammal. I think a tiger is possibly the most beautiful mammal in the world, maybe the most beautiful organism in the world. Well, second to my wife, son, and daughter, maybe. But other than that, yeah, tiger is fantastic.
And if you could be anywhere in the world, notwithstanding the COVID pandemic at the moment, where would you be right now?
Masai Mara.
Right.
In Kenya. I was planning to go there in April this year, but had to cancel. So yeah, that's where I would like to be at the moment. That's where I'm hoping to be sometime in the autumn. If things change, we'll see what happens. But yeah, no. Lots of larks down there. Also some exciting mammals and other birds, but yeah, no.
Good. Okay, before we go to the gallery party time, I just want to tell you that tomorrow we got a guy called Matt Young, who's an ornithologist, scientist from the US, who will be talking about finches. He's an expert in crossbills and redpolls in particular, so he'll be talking tomorrow. On Wednesday, we got a lady called Harriet Mead, an artist who makes sculptures out of scrap metal, and she's amazing, so she'll be talking about her work. Thursday, we have a lady called Miriam Darlington, who's a writer. She's written several books, and she writes for the Times in England, and she'll be talking about her books. And Stephen Moss on Friday is a producer for the BBC, or was a producer, worked with people like Bill Oddie. He's also a prolific writer. He writes a book every 5 minutes, and he'll be talking about nature writing. So that's coming up this week, guys. So if you fancy, please go to the website and book that. Per, thank you very much. Keep looking up